Before the name Medusa ever made men tremble, before the sight of her face could freeze the blood in your veins and turn flesh to cold, unfeeling stone, she was something else entirely. She was a girl who laughed, a girl who prayed, a girl whose beauty was so staggering that sailors wept when they saw her walking along the cliffs of the Aegean coast, not because they feared her, but because they could not believe anything so perfect belonged to the same broken world they did. And yet, she would become the most feared creature in all of creation. But here is the question that the myths rarely ask, the question that gets buried beneath the blood and the stone and the severed head held aloft like a trophy. What exactly did Medusa do to deserve what happened to her? Stay with me, because the answer is more disturbing than the monster herself. Long before the serpents, before the wings, before the hollow scream that could crumble a man's courage to dust, Medusa was born mortal. This alone made her extraordinary among the creatures of the ancient world, for her sisters, Athena and Uriel, were born immortal Gorgons from the very beginning, creatures of the deep sea and the dark places between the stars. But Medusa entered the world as flesh and breath and heartbeat. She was given a life that could end. She was given beauty that could fade. She was given everything that makes a human being precious and everything that makes them vulnerable. She was the daughter of Phorcys and Ceto, ancient sea deities who dwelled in the primordial depths before the Olympians had even claimed their thrones. Her parentage was divine, yes, but the gods of the deep were not the gods of power. They were gods of the forgotten places, of the dark water beneath the light, of the things that existed before order was imposed upon chaos. Medusa came from that old world, that wild world. And from the very beginning, she carried within her an extraordinary and dangerous thing, mortal beauty in an immortal age. Her hair, and remember this, because it matters, her hair was the thing poets could not stop writing about. Long, dark, gleaming like the surface of still water at midnight. It moved when she walked as though it were alive, as though even her hair understood it was magnificent. Men composed odes to it. Women whispered about it with the particular ache of those who recognize perfection and know they do not possess it. Even the gods noticed. And when the gods notice a mortal, the mortal should be afraid. But Medusa was not afraid. She was devout. She chose to dedicate her life to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, and the cold, calculating intelligence that separates civilization from savagery. Athena's temple was a place of sacred discipline. Her priestesses swore vows, not merely promises, but oaths cut into the soul like iron into stone. Among those oaths was chastity, a vow of purity, a commitment to remain untouched by love, by passion, by the consuming fire of desire that the gods themselves could never fully control. Medusa made that vow. She meant it. She walked into Athena's temple as a young woman, and she gave her life to the goddess with the particular sincerity of someone who has decided, completely and without reservation, what they believe in. And for a time, for a shining, terrible, brief time, it was enough. Picture the temple as it would have stood in the ancient world. White marble columns rising toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly, the smell of olive oil and incense burning in the sacred braziers, the low, rhythmic sound of prayer, like a tide that never fully retreats. Medusa moved through those halls with the measured grace of someone who has made peace with herself. She tended the sacred fires. She performed the rites. She swept the marble floors and arranged the offerings and whispered the prayers she had memorized until they lived not just in her mind, but in the muscle of her throat, rising automatically like breathing. She was, by every account, the perfect priestess. And that perfection, that radiant, luminous, heartbreaking perfection, was precisely what damned her. Because the gods of ancient Greece did not love virtue the way we imagine virtue should be loved. They noticed it the way a flame notices dry wood. He came from the sea. Of course he did. Of course the destroyer came from the place Medusa had always been connected to through blood, through ancestry, through the deep oceanic pull of her divine heritage. Poseidon, lord of the seas, brother of Zeus, shaker of the earth, and sovereign of every wave that had ever crashed against every shore since the beginning of time, he came to the temple of Athena. Now pause here, really pause, because what is about to happen is the moment everything changes, and it is crucial that you understand the geography of power before it unfolds. Poseidon is one of the three supreme Olympians. His trident can split mountains. His rage can swallow cities whole. He answers to no one except perhaps his brother Zeus, and even that is a negotiation rather than a submission. He is not a god who asks. He is not a god who waits. He is a god who takes, because the entire ancient world had been arranged to accommodate his wanting. And he wanted Medusa. What happened in the Temple of Athena is recorded with the cold clinical brevity of sources that did not think it necessary to explain. The accounts tell us that Poseidon violated Medusa within the sacred walls of Athena's most holy sanctuary. Some ancient voices soften it, call it a seduction, a union, as though the word union can dignify the destruction of a priestess's sacred vow in the very house of the goddess she served. But the weight of the act, the violation of the oath, the shattering of the sacred space, the impossibility of Medusa's ability to refuse a god who moved with the force of oceans, this is not a story of seduction. This is a story of a woman who had no power in a world built entirely by and for those who had it. What did Medusa do in those moments? What does any person do when the world they built their life around is torn apart in an instant? The sources do not tell us. They never tell us what the victim was feeling. That silence is its own kind of violence. But the worst was yet to come. Athena saw it, the goddess of wisdom, whose sight missed nothing, whose intelligence was the sharpest instrument in all of Olympus. She saw what had happened in her temple. She saw the sacred space defiled. She saw her holy ground made impure. She saw one of her most devoted priestesses broken within the very walls that were supposed to represent divine protection. And Athena was furious. Here is where the myth becomes something that should disturb us deeply, even within its own ancient context, because what Athena did next was not justice. It was the opposite of justice. Dressed in divine authority and served with the cold precision of someone who understood exactly how power works and chose to use it against the powerless. Athena did not punish Poseidon. Of course she did not. He was her uncle. He was a supreme Olympian. He was the kind of god who, if challenged, could retaliate with earthquakes and tsunamis and the systematic destruction of everything Athena cared about in the mortal world. The political calculus of Olympus, that eternal calculation of divine consequence and celestial hierarchy, it made Poseidon untouchable. And Medusa was not. So Athena turned her wrath, this blazing, justified, terrible wrath, and she aimed it at the one person in the entire story who had done nothing wrong. What would you have done, standing in that temple, having given everything to a goddess who repaid you with punishment? What would you have done, feeling the divine curse descend like cold water, like darkness, like the slow horror of becoming something you never chose to be? The transformation was not instant. The cruelest curses never are. It began with the hair. Those magnificent dark waves that poets had mourned over, that sailors had wept for, they began to move on their own, not the gentle movement of wind and beauty. A writhing, hissing, independent movement as each strand thickened and scaled and divided and became something that breathed and tasted the air with a forked black tongue. Where there had been beauty, there was now a crown of living serpents, and they were always moving, always awake. They never slept, which means she never slept, not truly, not without the constant sensation of them curling and tightening around her thoughts. Her eyes changed. This was perhaps the most merciful cruelty of all, if such a thing can exist. She could no longer see herself in still water, because what looked back from the reflection was something that could not be categorized, something that existed at the exact point where beautiful and terrible become the same word. Her eyes had become weapons, not by her choice, not through any act of malice or desire, simply by the decree of a goddess who had nowhere else to aim her pain. Anything that met her gaze directly turned to stone. Think about what that means, not as a power, as a prison. She could not look at her sisters without killing them. She could not look at the animals that wandered too close to her refuge without freezing them into gray, silent permanence. She could not catch the eye of another living creature and experience the simplest, most fundamental human exchange, that moment of recognized consciousness, the wordless understanding that passes between two creatures who see each other and know they are both real, both present, both alive. She was utterly, catastrophically alone. She went to the edge of the world, to a place the maps of ancient Greece marked with vague, frightened strokes of the pen, somewhere beyond Libya, somewhere in the direction the sun set and did not return from, in the territory of night and myth, and the things even the gods preferred not to think about too carefully. There she built what could barely be called a life. More accurately, she endured what could barely be called an existence. The island she inhabited was made of stone, not metaphorically. The figures of men who had come seeking her out of pride or curiosity or bloodlust, they stood frozen around her like a grotesque garden, preserved in their final expressions of horror or bravado or desperate regret. She moved among them sometimes. Did she speak to them? The myths do not say. But it is not difficult to imagine that she did. In the long dark nights, when the serpents on her head whispered in languages she had never asked to understand. It is not difficult to imagine her pressing her hand against the cold chest of a frozen soldier and feeling the terrible irony of being surrounded by people and being more alone than if she had been the only living thing left in the world. She had stopped praying. What god would she pray to? The goddess she had served had cursed her. The god who had wronged her suffered no consequence. The universe of divine justice she had built her entire life around had revealed itself to be not justice at all, but simply the preferences of the powerful, dressed in the language of righteousness. But something stranger had happened to her in that isolation, something the myths hint at but rarely explore. She had not become evil. This is the detail that changes everything, the thread you must pull if you want to understand what this story is actually about. She did not hunt men. She did not seek blood. She did not transform her wound into weaponry and march back toward the world that had shattered her. She stayed away. She was dangerous, yes, catastrophically so, in the way that a fire is dangerous or a cliff edge is dangerous. Not because of malice, because of what she had been made into. There is a difference, and it is not a small one. Which brings us to the hero, which brings us to Perseus. Perseus arrived with the particular energy of a young man who has been told by gods and kings and the entire structure of heroic mythology that he is exceptional, that his destiny is written in stars, that the monsters of the world exist specifically to be defeated by men like him. He carried a shining shield borrowed from Athena herself. Yes, the same Athena who had cursed Medusa, who now equipped the instrument of Medusa's death. He carried a sword. He had winged sandals from Hermes, and the cap of invisibility from Hades, and the guidance of divine voices that had never once spoken in Medusa's direction except to condemn her. He came not because Medusa had threatened anyone, not because she had emerged from her isolation to take revenge on the world that had discarded her. He came because a king named Poseidon, trying to dispose of a young man he found inconvenient, had made an offhand boast at a feast, and Perseus had impulsively promised to bring back Medusa's head as a gift. Her death was a side effect of a political argument she had never been part of. The approach was everything Medusa could never have. He moved in the peripheral vision of a shield used as a mirror, watching her reflection rather than facing her directly, using the very nature of her curse as a weapon against her. He crept through the stone garden of her accumulated witnesses. He found her sleeping, perhaps the only true sleep she had experienced since the curse, those terrible serpents finally stilled enough for unconsciousness to take her. What did she dream in those last moments? Did she dream of the temple, white and clean and full of incense smoke? Did she dream of the girl she had been, kneeling before Athena's statue with the absolute faith of someone who believed the universe was ordered and fair and that goodness was rewarded? Did she dream of her hair, moving freely in a sea wind before it became something else entirely? The sword fell. The accounts describe what came next with the breathless precision of writers who found the miraculous more interesting than the mourned. From the blood that fell from Medusa's severed neck, two creatures were born, Chrysaor, a giant warrior, and Pegasus, the winged horse, both said to be the offspring of her encounter with Poseidon. Even in death, she was giving life to others. Even in her ending, she was generative, creative, extraordinary. Perseus lifted her head. He placed it in a bag, careful not to look at it directly, because even in death the curse held. Even dead, she was still dangerous. Even as a severed head, She retained the power that had been inflicted upon her, still capable of turning men to stone if they met her eyes, still defined entirely by what had been done to her rather than what she had done. He flew back across the world with her. He used her head as a weapon 3 more times before presenting it to Athena, who set it at the center of her great shield, the Aegis, where it remained as an emblem of divine power and divine terror. Medusa's face became Athena's symbol of protection. The goddess who had cursed her spent eternity carrying her image. There is something in that detail that feels like the final note of an unresolved chord, something that rings and does not settle. What remained of Medusa herself? Her body lay on that island at the edge of the world, among the stone figures of all the men who had come looking for something, glory, adventure, proof of their own courage. She lay among them in the end, reduced at last to the same stillness she had inflicted on them. No longer the monster, no longer the priestess, no longer the girl with the extraordinary hair, simply a body in a place that existed in the margins of the known world. But the blood still fell. As Perseus flew over the Libyan desert, drops of blood escaped the bag, and where they fell, serpents rose from the sand. She was still creating, still leaving marks on the world, even as a severed head in a hero's bag. The earth received her blood and made life from it, the same way the ocean had received her suffering and eventually made legend from it. And Pegasus, born from her blood, born from the violation that had destroyed her life, born from the precise moment of her deepest wound, became one of the most beautiful creatures in all of mythology. The winged horse that carried heroes, that struck the earth with his hoof to create springs of water, that flew between the human world and the divine. That flew. How strange that the creature born from Medusa's suffering learned immediately to fly, as though beauty could rise from even the worst things, as though the universe had a dark sense of compensation. Or perhaps that reading is too comfortable. Perhaps it is too easy to find meaning in the wreckage of someone's life and call it beautiful. Perhaps the more honest ending is this: she was a girl who prayed. She was a woman who kept her vows. She was a victim who was punished for being victimized, who was cursed for the crime of being powerless in a world where power belonged to those who had done the damage. She lived in isolation for years, or decades, or centuries. The myths are not precise, because the suffering of those without power has never been carefully measured. And then she was killed by a young man who needed her head for a purpose that had nothing to do with her. And she became a monster in every story ever told about her. Except that when you look at what she actually did, not what she was accused of, not what her curse made her capable of, but what she chose to withdraw. She chose the edge of the world. She chose the company of stone and serpent over the cruelty of a civilization that had no place for her. There is a kind of dignity in that withdrawal, a kind of integrity that the hero who killed her was never required to demonstrate. She never asked to be a monster, she only ever asked to serve. And the question that the oldest stories leave in the air, unresolved as smoke, sharp as the edge of a divine sword, was Medusa truly the villain of this story, or was she the only character in it who never once had a choice? The serpents on her head are still now. The stone garden is quiet. The winged horse circles somewhere above the clouds, casting no shadow. And somewhere at the edge of the world, in the place the maps marked with fear and vagueness, and the particular uncertainty that ancient mapmakers reserved for things they could not explain, the marble floor of a ruined temple still holds the impression of a woman who knelt there once in complete faith and rose a monster for it. The gods have not answered for it yet. Perhaps they never will.